Hello. Libya's warring leaders and powerful outsiders who back them are at a summit in Berlin aimed at ending years of chaos and conflict. And we're waiting for a post-summit media conference to begin. We'll hear from the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, as well as her foreign minister, the UN Secretary General and the UN Special Envoy to Libya. While the Chancellor is hosting 12 world leaders, including the presidents of Turkey, Russia and France, and the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Their priorities are to curb foreign military interference and solidify a ceasefire. Well, Russia's Vladimir Putin met Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan earlier, and they back rival sides. Russia supports warlord Khalifa Haftar, while Turkey is helping the UN-recognized government Haftar is fighting against. Their previous ceasefire efforts have broken down.
We have been trying on a number of occasions to have a ceasefire agreement signed. The National Government of Accord signed a ceasefire agreement. Yes, it wasn't signed by the other party led by Haftar. If we fail to have a ceasefire in place and if we fail to have an agreement signed, we will never see Haftar's hostilities coming to an end.
We thank both the parties for coming to Moscow, as they both had heeded our calls and they had both responded to our demands of a ceasefire. Now we are in Berlin. We hope for more success in this particular crisis.
Well, back in Libya, fighting has continued near the capital, Tripoli, and there have been reports of artillery fire as Haftar's forces try to take an area south of the city. We'll speak to Al Jazeera's Mahmoud Abdelwahed in Tripoli to tell us more about that in a moment. Live first to Jamal Shayal joining us from Berlin. And as we wait for that press conference to take place in Berlin, Jamal, just talk us through what the draft communique says.
Well, Doreen, the communique that we've been given, or at least that we've seen, albeit a draft one and not the final one, if one is to be agreed upon and what we're expecting, goes through different sections, different kind of sub-sections within it. One of the most important things, let's start with a reiteration of the ceasefire and a reiteration of a UN-imposed arms embargo on Libya, one that was put in by the United Nations all the way back in 2011. And why is that probably more important? We're looking at today, as you mentioned, whilst these talks are taking place, and as we'll hear from Mahmoud very shortly, fighting still going on. This despite the arms embargo, this despite recent ceasefire agreements brokered by Russia and Turkey. And the whole point is that many are skeptical that even though there is this political process that is taking place, the fact that there is no mechanism of ensuring that both those within Libya who are fighting stop and those outside of Libya who are arming them stop arming them, then it's difficult to see the political process going anywhere. Well, what is that political process anyway? Let's imagine that it does start to take off and is successful. According to this draft resolution, it talks about the United Nations setting up some working group, essentially what they're calling a follow-up committee, the International Follow-up Committee, which will be made up of the member states here under the chairmanship of the United Nations Special Envoy on Libya and a rotating co-chairmanship between those countries. And it will be meeting both monthly and twice a month, depending on the different working groups and what they will be working towards. Another significant thing in this communique talks about the economic aspects of Libya, and that is particularly with regards to the international community respecting the sovereignty of Libya's state financial institutions, namely the central bank and the Tripoli-based oil company. Why is that significant? Because in the past couple of days, Haftar's forces are believed to have taken control of certain oil fields and shut them down, essentially crippling Tripoli from one of its main sources of income. Also, the national bank, or central bank rather, the fact that Russia, one of the participants here, printed money for Haftar's forces, essentially circumventing the central bank and its purpose, also something that has worried a lot of people. We're looking at those pictures, waiting for the press conference to start. Another very important point to note here is that firstly, those who will be speaking is just the United Nations and the Germans, no Libyans present on that table. And even the title of this conference was only written in German and English. That may be semantics, but it's definitely a signal of just how maybe wouldn't say irrelevant, but how insignificant the actual Libyan players are vis-a-vis, or at least if we compare them to the regional and international powers who are really the driving force of what's taking place here in Libya.
Yeah, and speaking of the regional international powers, Jamal, going into this, they had varied and different stakes, you can say, in the country. So ahead of this meeting, were there any signs that these differences had been made a little bit smaller?
No, in fact, those, actually, let's take on two different parts. In terms of maybe the major players, so Russia and Turkey, yes, there were signs that there was a coming together, or at least an acceptance that Ankara and Moscow had to cooperate, or were more willing to cooperate with each other compared to how they were, for example, in the Syria crisis in the beginning, several years ago, when they were at odds and there wasn't that cooperation. Maybe the Astana process in Syria and all that's been achieved as far as Moscow and Russia's interests are concerned, there has been an incentive for them to do the same. So the gap between those two major players has evidently reduced. However, for example, between the United Arab Emirates and Qatar on each side, or Egypt and Algeria on each side, that hasn't happened. And proof of that is the fact that major countries that are important with regards to Libya, namely Algeria, Tunisia, and Qatar, weren't invited to this conference. In fact, Tunisia and Morocco, rather. In fact, Algeria, it took a lot of convincing and lobbying by certain groups to ensure that they were present here. And in fact, the two major Libyan players themselves, the UN-recognized government's Prime Minister Fayez Sarraj and the renegade Khalifa Haftar, did not sit together on the same table, as far as we understand, as far as we were told, with the Prime Minister saying he refused to sit next to somebody who is responsible for the death of Libyans. So there is still a lot to be done in order to bring not just both sides within Libya together, but even regionally and internationally.
Okay, Jamal, we'll cross over to you as and when we hear from officials in that press conference in Berlin. We'll, of course, cross over to Berlin as soon as we see them speaking. For now, let's find out what's happening on the ground in Libya, and that's where Mahmoud Abdelwahed is joining us from, because as this takes place in Berlin, Mahmoud, we are hearing of some fighting that's going on in Tripoli when there's meant to be a ceasefire in place.
Well, it's still so fragile, Doreen, this ceasefire, but it seems that what's going on in Berlin is in another, it's going on another path, because there are so many hardliners here on both sides who do not want to stop the fighting. And in fact, the people here, many people here, believe that the Berlin talks are meant to bridge the gap between the countries involved in Libya, not between the Libyan rivals. And now here, for example, the Western camp led by the UN-recognized Prime Minister, Fayez Sarraj, they say that they cannot trust Haftar and they cannot make peace with Haftar's camp unless he is tried for what they call the war crimes that have been committed by his forces since April the 4th, since they launched the military campaign to seize Tripoli. There have been so many question marks. They have been addressing these the military camp on the ground, because many military leaders on the ground, they say that they cannot hand over their weapons and they cannot stop fighting until Haftar's forces are pushed out of southern Tripoli. Meanwhile, in the east of the country, the military brigades supporting the warlord Khalifa Haftar, and they have taken control of the oil terminals. They say that they cannot accept any foreign intervention in Libya. They mean the Turkish military assistance to the government of national accord. But meanwhile, the United Arab Emirates, along with Egypt, France, and Russia, they have been supporting Haftar for the past few years. In fact, the United Arab Emirates has been supporting Haftar with advanced weapons, fighter jets, and also it has an air base in the east of the country since 2015. So it seems that there is a huge gap between the two rival factions, and it might take a long time and effort until this gap is bridged between the two rival factions in Libya. It seems that this ceasefire is not being observed by both rival factions, and military commanders with the government here say that they have been documenting several violations by Haftar's forces during the past few days. Remember that Haftar did not sign the ceasefire accord in Moscow, and here in Tripoli and in the west of Libya, under the control of the UN-recognized government, many people believe that this conflict is not going to end anytime soon unless Haftar's forces leave the south of Tripoli. In fact, they say they cannot make any peace with Haftar unless Haftar's forces retreat and go back to where they came from before April the 4th.
Okay, Mahmoud, thank you for that update from Tripoli.